Well, welcome to our first class in the craft of editing here at FXBHD. Liz, really excited about having you involved this term.
It's great. I'm really enjoying preparing.
Why don't we first talk about what your job entails as a commercial editor, because, of course, that's going to be the focus of the course this term.
Well, I've been a commercial editor for a little over 20 years now. Started as an assistant. I think I talked a little bit about this in our little teaser. Started as an assistant on film, worked through an Avid, worked as an assistant, became an editor. It's been great. Basically, an advertising agency is the person who would hire me. I'm not hired by a director or a company or anything like that. The agency would hire me after they are done with the shooting with the director. I'd say 90% of the time I really don't have any kind of contact with the director even, which I think a lot of people are shocked at. It's basically, sometimes the director will give me a call. Every once in a while I'll be on the shoot, but most of the time I get handed film with the agency coming here and saying, here's what we have, here's what we want. You go to it from there.
Now, occasionally there are editors, though, that do work up relationships with editors, but do you think something has to do with your location, being in Chicago versus Los Angeles?
Yeah, definitely. Geographics has something to do with it. I know a lot more of my friends who are editors in Los Angeles will work directly with a director since they are mostly on the coast.
Okay. Now, I think there's this misnomer that exists that every single commercial editor, all they do is they sit in a room and punch buttons. That's what we think of you as effectively. And just do the creative craft of editing all the time.
Right.
But you actually wear multiple hats, don't you?
Oh, definitely. What my job entails is the fact that I sit here and I do a creative edit, but then I also follow the job through the entire process with the agency. So, once the agency and I work out what we're going to be doing in this room and we have a cut that we like, it goes to the client. The client takes a look at it, gives us some feedback, and then we go through a whole finishing portion of the job that I am in charge of. So besides being a creative editor, I need to be a creative in all these other rooms where we go. So in audio, I need to have a good set of ears in those rooms to fine-tune maybe some of the technical things too that the agency wouldn't be aware of. You've got a lot of creatives in that room who are interested in their own particular little bugs about what they want to hear, but I'm there to not only creatively make a call on that, but also make sure, are there any pops in it? Are there, all the technical things that maybe they wouldn't be paying attention to. And likewise, when we get to our color grading session, we take the film or the files that have been shot earlier on. We go through, we color correct every scene, top to bottom, as far as exactly what we're using in the scene, grading it very particularly. I'm a set of eyes in that room, once again, to put my creative spin on it, but also make sure, hey, is everything that we're doing here going to work for what we're finishing? Are we in the right resolution? Do we need to think about anything in that process that I know that maybe other people don't know?
Now, I would just like to interesting take it back a step, actually, at the beginning of the job. And you're owner of a fairly small facility, so people maybe wear more multiple hats than most editors would. But why don't you take us back even from the beginning, where you actually have to do bid on jobs, right?
Right.
Actually from the start.
Right. So another one of my hats is producing and being in charge of some finances. I certainly have a producer here. Don is a great producer here at Hoot Nanny, and thank God we have him, because it helps so much to have another person who's really the main person on the ball. But it's still my responsibility to sit down, look at those boards, think about what it's going to entail, go through it with Don, bring whatever I think creatively I might want to add, and let him know, hey, on this one, hey, I'd like to, let's bring some design into it. Let's, take some creative wherewithal there to put the bid together so that I know we're covered for whatever I might want to try. As the job goes through, I'm also responsible, if, Don's not in my room every day knowing what's going on, if things are starting to get out of hand, to say, Don, somebody's got to put the hurt on this, because it's going to go way over budget. So it's my job too to try to keep the clients in budget, and if they're going over budget, let them know. That's a part, that I never really thought about when I started going into editing. I was like, I figured you'd sit here all day in your room, every once in a while see somebody do your creative edit, and boom, go on. And certainly there are jobs that are like that. That's not part of my job. I mean, I have many facets, not just that one.
Now, there are some places, just like you say, there are some places, though, that do have producers and that deal with the money, and there are editors out there who don't ever deal with that stuff.
Right, right. But I think I really enjoy that part of it, too. I think it gives you a good handle on what things cost. You know, if you're giving somebody a free deal, which I've always been in a place where I could decide how much I was going to charge my client. What's realistic? You know, what is a realistic thing to get through in a time frame with the money involved, and what isn't?
Right. Actually, one thing I do want to touch, speaking of bidding, actually, it's hard at first, isn't it, when you start bidding jobs? I mean, what are some tricks that you use to kind of guess? Because you are making, I mean, you're making an educated guess, really.
Well, I'll tell you that educated guess is certainly much easier now, 20 years into it. I would say that you know, the experience through these 20 years has taught me that some of it you can only learn through experience. But I will say that when you're bidding a job, you need to take into account, you know, what kind of clients are you working with? That's one of them. You may know the clients already, and you'll know what they're like. Are they people that make a decision quickly? Are they people that like to play around a little bit before maybe they decide on what they like? Do you know that the client sometimes can be a bear and just, you know, is going to have a lot of revisions? So I think when Donna and I go into a bid, we always think about, hey, you know, we know this client, they're going to go faster. Hey, we know this client, let's put some extra money in there. It certainly helps.
And the other thing you touched on, I think, is interesting. Did you ever think that you would be like a referee or a psychiatrist during the job? Because it really is interesting if you take a look at the industry. I know a lot of really talented, creative people who actually somewhat fail in the commercial world because they're not a good people person. And on the other end, I know some people who are maybe like, I wonder how they can get done, but they succeed based upon their people skills. So,
yeah.
I mean, how much of that is part of your job?
It's a big part of my job. It's a big part of my job. And luckily, I think it's a part of my job I do pretty well.
Right.
There's a really fine line when you're sitting in this room of how much, number one, just entertainment value. You know, like sitting in here, when you sit with people all day, do you have fun with them or do you not? And I think having a room that's having fun and laughing and having a good time while they're working has been one of my strengths.
Right.
In another way too, there's a very fine line of how much of your creative stamp do you put on it, and when do you decide it's time to let go?
Right.
I certainly stand up for a cut I believe in, or if I think that something is going in a bad way, I'll tell my client. But there is a certain point where that person is paying the bills, and you have to read the room to know when it's time to just move on and say, okay, that's my cut that I'll have for later, but this obviously isn't what they want. And that's one of the hardest parts of my job.
Yeah, and it varies from agency to agency, really, the way the agency works, who has input. You know, some agencies, the art directors and the writers, they have to have equal input in everything. Others have very specific roles. But you also do some refereeing at times when you talk about, because I've been in some sessions where there's some really divergent ideas going on. Right.
So it's sort of my job to kind of calm the room down, you know. Maybe we'll try to do something that, you know, hopefully there's some in-between space where you can get to, where everyone's happy, but that's not always true. So it's also my job to sort of read the room and decide, okay, who is the power player here? Who needs to be listened to, and who do I maybe need to discount, just, you know, because it's my job, you know. It's not always about, it may not always be about the best creative idea. Sometimes it's not.
Right.
So there's a lot. Yeah, that's
there's
a good
commerce.
idea. Yeah, it's commerce and it's therapy.
Well, that's good. That's a really good overview of what you do. Before we dive into this class and start talking about some of the other stuff you're doing for the second half of this specific class, why don't you talk about a little bit the entire term in general, kind of what your goals are?
Right. Well, my goals are, number one, to give the students some hands-on experience. So we're going to have a couple projects in this term where we hand out some footage and let everybody take a crack at it, and then we'll critique it and talk about it. I'm sure not too harshly, obviously. I've always been very good at that with my assistants that I've brought up through the ranks. Of, you know, I'm a good critiquer without, you know, I'm not gonna rub your nose in it. So please don't be worried or afraid that, you know, it's going to be harsh. It's not going to be. We're gonna grow through the experience. We're also we're gonna do a lot of theory stuff about how you go about a job, how do you get into it, and how do you organize your projects as well as your mind in when you get all this footage, how to piece through it. And I'm going to go through a job that I worked on a few months ago and really tell you what my mindset was as I went through making my first cuts. Then we'll also take that same project through the whole finishing process, and we're going to go to some of my suppliers and talk about what went on in those rooms, maybe some of the situations we had with clients, or talk about what they actually did to enhance the spot, so we can see how the whole process works with a bunch of creatives in these places adding on to make it a better spot in the end.
Cool, sounds great. Now what about the second half of this specific class?
This second part of this class is going to touch on some theories of editing, just because I think you sort of need a little background before we get into the nuts and bolts of it. So we'll work on that in the second half.
Cool.
So welcome to the second part of the class. In this part, we're going to focus on some of the styles of editing. I'm sure as we go through some of these terms, they're going to seem familiar to you. You will have seen them in films and TV shows and things that you've watched. You know, we're not rewriting anything here, but I think as we go over these terms, it's going to be much more obvious to you when you do see them, so that you'll be aware of them, and maybe when you are doing your own editing, you will know when you're breaking the rules and when you're adhering to the rules. So in general, you can classify editing into two specific styles. There's continuity editing and emphatic editing. We're going to start today with continuity editing. So continuity editing is pretty much the most common form of narrative editing. It's what most films are. It doesn't seek to call attention to itself in any way. Some people call it invisible editing. The most common characteristic of continuity editing is it maintains time and space. If you're going to have any lapses in time, they're going to show that by a dissolve. If you're going to have any lapses in space, or if you need to establish the space, you're going to do it right from the start. You're going to start everything with a wide shot so that the viewer knows exactly where they are in the scene. And you're going to slowly go in from shot to shot, from wide shot to medium shot to close-up, just so that there's never a question of where you might be. So the first clip I'm going to show you today is a clip from To Kill a Mockingbird. It's a scene that happens very near the beginning of the film. You're going to see it start with a nice big wide shot showing the little town. It has a lot of camera motion that starts to focally take you in closer and closer. But the shots, too, go from a wide shot to a medium shot to a close-up as we establish the town. We concentrate on the main characters. And finally, we have a conversation between two of the characters.
Macomb was a tired old town, even in 1932 when I first knew it. Somehow it was hotter then. Men's stiff collars wilted by 9 in the morning. Ladies bathed before noon, after their 3 o'clock nap. And by nightfall were like soft tea cakes with frostings of sweat and sweet talcum. The day was 24 hours long, but it seemed longer. There was no hurry, for there was nowhere to go and nothing to buy, no money to buy it with, although Macomb County had recently been told that it had nothing to fear but fear itself. That summer, I was 6 years old.
Morning, Miss Cunningham.
Oh, morning, miss.
My daddy's getting dressed. Would you like me to call her for you?
No, miss, I don't care to bother.
Why, it's no bother, Miss Cunningham. Very happy to see you. Attica? Attica? Here's Miss Cunningham.
Good morning, Walter. Morning, Mr. Finch. I didn't want to bother you none. I brung you these here hickory nuts as part of my entailment.
Well, I thank you. The collards we had last week were delicious.
Well, morning.
Morning. Scott, I think maybe next time Mr. Cunningham comes, you better not call me.
Oh, I thought you'd want to thank him.
Oh, I do. I think it embarrasses him to be thanked.
So the next convention of continuity editing is the match cut, and I'm sure this is a really simple one. Basically, when you go from one shot to another, you seek to maintain the action in the scene. So if a person is holding up their hand, in the next scene they would be holding up their hand. It just makes it much less of a jarring cut. Another convention of continuity editing is the 180-degree rule. This is drawing an invisible line between the action in your scene. Say there's two people sitting, you draw a line between them, and the camera would never cross over that line. Now, certainly this is a cinematography issue more than anything, but sometimes an editor will have many shots, maybe from one side and then a reverse angle of the other. In general, you want to stay on the one side so that there's always a continuous relationship of the people in the scene or the elements in the scene, and the viewer always knows where they are. Here I'm going to show you a scene from Bonnie and Clyde, and you'll see in the scene that we've got Bonnie on the left and Claude on the right within this car, and the camera never, no matter how many times it cuts back and forth between them, it never crosses over that invisible line.
What you writing?
Writing a poem about us.
Yeah? Let me hear it. Come on.
Okay, let me finish this. It's called The Story of Bonnie and Clyde. You've heard the story of Jesse James, of how he lived and died. If you're still in need of something to read, here's the story of Bonnie and Clyde.
You think if I sent that into newspapers that print it, I'm going to do it.
The next rule I'd like to talk about is the 30-degree rule. This is sort of the sister rule to the 180-degree. The idea is that if you have a scene cutting from one to another, the idea is that the camera would move at least 30 degrees around the rotation of that subject. So say you've got a wide shot here and then a medium shot. You're going to take the camera and just move it slightly so it's not on the exact same axis as the first shot that it followed. It just softens the cut point just a little bit if you're not just going straight out to another focal length. Eyeline match is another great way to keep everything flowing very, very gently. The idea is that a character would have a scene shot, is what a lot of people call it, where they are obviously looking off into the distance, and the scene that comes after it would be whatever that character might be seeing. Here I've got a classic voyeur clip for you of Jimmy Stewart in Rear Window, and you'll watch that in his scene shot, he's actually directionally telling you where people are located as he looks out his window.
Well, if you want anything, just ring.
Window shopper.
The last convention of continuity editing is cutting an action. Certainly to make a cut point less clear, you want to continue action from one shot into another. So say a person's throwing a ball, you want to cut in the middle of that throwing action and continue it into the next shot rather than letting them throw the ball and then cutting to a static frame. Just keeps the viewer's eye going through that whole transition. So just to recap, in continuity editing, the narrative is the most important element here, and usually it's told just through the thematic content in the frame, rather than the editing telling the story for you. So let's move on to emphatic editing. Whereas continuity editing seeks to maintain time and space, emphatic editing is just the opposite. In emphatic editing, time can be overlapping. We can have no linear story whatsoever. We can jump back in time to any extent and let the viewer kind of sort it out in their mind as to when things were happening. As far as space, it's uncommon to have an establishing shot showing the viewer where they are. A lot of times maybe you'll start with a really close-up tight shot, a graphic shot, and let the viewer sort of decipher the environment as you reveal it to him or her. Certainly the jump cut is one of the primary tools of emphatic editing. We can make it through focal length of just having a slightly varying focal length that is so close that it just seems to jar you. Here is a great example of that from The Diving Bell and the Butterfly. And in it, we have a character who is in a coma and not quite responsive coming out of it, and he sees the face of one of his loved ones, and we're seeing what he's seeing.
ESARINTULONDPCS ESARICC EULL ESAARIINDT. Cela fait ESAII ESARINN. 1. Cela fait-il 1 ESARINTULLIIBB? Cela fait-il un livre?
The axial cut is similar to the jump cut, but it takes place on an invisible line that would be between the camera and the subject. So you have a subject in a wide shot walking along, all of a sudden you're tight close-up, and you're straight on that same plane. So it's sort of taking the 30-degree rule and sort of saying, let's forget about it. So it makes that jump in focal length very much apparent. Overlapping action is another way of drawing attention to the edit. Instead of continuous action that looks like a linear, maybe you repeat action along the way with a person continuing their action twice, or maybe even leaving something out. Certainly a way to draw attention. And finally, cutting on pauses. Instead of waiting for that action to play out in 2 shots, maybe you let it play out, have a dramatic pause, and then cut. It makes that cut a feature instead of something invisible. So why use emphatic editing? There's many reasons to do it. I would say one of the first reasons is it's a great way to tell a story. A relational cut is a juxtaposition of scenes that creates a new narrative. So in order to tell your story, maybe that next cut point is the raison d'etre. So in here, we're going to look at Rushmore. It's a great scene with Bill Murray. We see Bill Murray in a hotel suite with some bees, and we're not quite sure why. So I think the editing will reveal itself. Another reason to employ emphatic editing is that the tension that it causes can mirror a psychological state. Here I'm going to have an example for you from Bonnie and Clyde. For the most part, that film, as well as many, is continuity editing through. Even though it was in the 70s, which has a lot more groovy editing than, say, the 90s or where we are now, it pretty much sticks to the straight and narrow. But when we get to certain tension points in the film, you'll see that all of a sudden we have some very choppy editing. We have some really dramatic pauses. We certainly have some things within the scenes that show us that something has gone awry. Here it is. It's a scene at the end of the film where Bonnie and Clyde meet their end.
Hey, is that Malcolm there?
I got a flat tire, I ain't got no spare.
Finally, emphatic editing can just be a stylistic choice. Certainly in music videos, you're going to see a lot of jumpy editing, a lot of crazy things happening. And, you know, it's just to cut to rhythm or to make it more visually appealing. There certainly doesn't have to be any big theory behind it. So how do you decide when to cut, when to make that cut point? We've got some rules we've gone over here, but I've got a couple ideas from some film theorists on how they decide when to cut. The first of them is Walter Murch. Walter Murch is an Academy Award-winning editor. He worked on Apocalypse Now. He also has a great book called In the Blink of an Eye, which is a wonderful book on editing if you have a chance to check it out, about Final Cut, actually. Walter says that there are 6 main criteria for evaluating when to cut. The first of those is emotion. He says, reflect what the editor believes the audience should be feeling at the moment. That's the moment when you cut. Does it portray that? Does it help that? Secondly, story. Does cut advance the story? Does it take you further into the narrative? Rhythm. Does the cut occur at a moment that's rhythmically interesting for that moment in time? Eye trace. Does the cut pay respect to the location and movement of the audience's focus of interest in the frame so that we know where they are going with their eyes and keeping that focus in the frame in the right place? Two-dimensional plane. Have we stuck with our 180-degree rule so we're on one side and we know where we are in that frame? And then three-dimensional place. Is the cut true to the physical spatial relationships within the narrative? Does it make sense in the whole gist of the whole film? Now, you take these rules into effect and they seem kind of stodgy, but the thing is that Walter weighed these 6 criteria with emotion being worth 51%. So what does it come down to? Subjectivity, really. It's good to think about those other things, but when it comes down to it, it's instinctive more than anything. Another theorist, an early film theorist, is Raymond Spottiswoode. And Raymond has what he called the peak of the content curve. The peak of the content curve is the idea that as you're watching a scene, you're taking in all of the elements in it, and once your eye has taken them all in, it's time to cut. And so for a complex scene, that's going to be a longer time that you sit and look at that scene. For a simple scene, don't need to stay on it so long. So it's more of an instinctual thing. And you know, that's what I would say to you, first of all, is you can take all of these rules into practice, but the more that you practice, the more that you spend time doing it, the more your instincts will evolve as to when is that perfect moment to cut. So that's what I would say to you. Practice, practice, practice. And hopefully in this class you're going to get a chance to do just some of that. We're going to have 2 projects in the class that we're going to hand out to you guys. The first one is going to be something that was actually cut for Effects PhD at one point. So we're going to put that out to you, have you put your spin on it and hand it back. We'll be critiquing it. The second one is yet to be announced. We'll get to that a little bit later in the term. And let me give you a little background on what's going to happen next week. Next week, we're going to hop into a job. This is a job that I worked on about 6 months ago. We're going to take it from the beginning, where we talk to the creatives, we know what's coming, we sort of prep them on what we needed, take it with the film coming into Hootenanny here, which is the post house where I work. Talk about what happens when somebody dumps a bunch of dailies in your plate. How do you start? How do you organize yourself? How do you begin cutting? What are some techniques for sort of paring it down and deciding where you go from there? So I look forward to seeing you in our class next week, and thanks so much.